Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we have a short tutorial on Pokeshells. In our standard playthrough Primus, we're about to start ranching Pokeshells. And the one reason people ranch Pokeshells? That's for the lime so you can make more steel. Now, ranching Pokeshells is almost the same as ranching anything else, like hatches. There's a few differences though that we need to make sure that we are aware of. One of the biggest differences is their diet. They eat polluted dirt and rot piles at a rate of 140 kilos per cycle. They then excrete 50% of that into sand. Now, getting a sustainable source of polluted dirt is what becomes the difficulty. Well, if your colonies are anything like mine, you're bound to have a couple of storage bins full of polluted dirt by at least early game. And if you continuously save up this polluted dirt for when you do have access to the Pokeshell, you can feed them for a decent amount of time. How much time? Well, one storage bin filled with 20,000 kilos of polluted dirt or rot pile will feed one Pokeshell for 142 cycles. Now, for my games, a ranch like this is probably not attainable. You can see here we're on sandbox mode, so whenever I want, I just create more polluted dirt. Not a big deal. But in a game on survival, you just don't have an infinitely sustainable access to polluted dirt. Now, there's always ways to create it. For instance, Paku. Half of everything they eat will produce polluted dirt. The problem is, we can easily find some infinitely sustainable seeds, but seeds are very small, and you can see that they only eat 0.3 kilos per cycle, which means you'd only be getting 0.15 kilos of polluted dirt. Now, there is algae at 140 kilos per cycle, which means it produces 70 kilos of polluted dirt per cycle. So basically, 2 Paco would be able to sustain 1 Pokeshell. The problem is, there's no infinitely sustainable source of algae. You may have also thought, well, I can use outhouses to provide enough polluted dirt. Well, if you really want to run outhouses, you kinda can do that. Each outhouse produces 19.7 kilos worth of polluted dirt. And as an example to show you how much polluted dirt you would need to make that happen, you would need 8 outhouses to create enough polluted dirt per cycle, or 8 duplicates using the same outhouse. But then the limiting factor becomes normal dirt, because for every 19.7 kilos of polluted dirt, the outhouse requires about 13 kilos of regular dirt. This is why I prefer a stable this size. I like 2 Pokeshells, and basically what happens is these Pokeshells become our breeders. Now, the Pokeshell reproduction is very similar to the hatches. While they're happy and groomed, they will lay a little over 5.5 eggs per lifetime. Their lifetime is 100 cycles. This stable setup is pretty standard and pretty simple. A couple of the additions, we have a deodorizer on the outside of it. Remember, our deodorizers go up to 3 tiles high, finding and destroying that polluted oxygen, so we stick it on a single tile here. One very important element of ranching Pokeshells is you need to get rid of their eggs. If they're in a stable with eggs, they become angry. I've set an example here. You can see these Pokeshells are looking angry. Their eyes lids are down a little bit, and they've changed colors. Well, we put Lyra in here, and unfortunately Lyra can't get out because we locked the door. What's going to happen is these Pokeshells are going to get pretty mad. And you can see, they'll keep attacking Lyra. They don't like the fact that she's in here with the egg. Now, before she dies, let's go ahead and let her out. Run, Lyra. Now, the Pokeshells don't always attack. I have found that some of the mechanics are a little bugged, and I've also found that if they're starving, they're more likely to attack. But they'll only do it if there's a row egg around. As you can see here, there's no row eggs because we've set up an auto sweeper and a conveyor loader to take all the eggs out so they don't get angry. Going back to my preferred stable, I have 2 Pokeshells in a stable that is 24 tiles in size. Each Pokeshell needs 12 tiles, otherwise they will turn to be cramped. Now, a Pokeshell will shed its molt twice in its life. The first time is when it goes from a baby Pokeshell, or a Pokeshell spawn, into adulthood. It sheds a small Pokeshell molt. And then once, when it dies, It will then shed a full-size Pokeshell molt. We then go to Ye Old Rock Crusher, and you can see that there's two categories. One for small Pokeshells, and one for large Pokeshells. Now the large Pokeshells produce 10 kilos of lime, and the small Pokeshells produce 5 kilos of lime. And that's the name of the game. Because remember, lime is one of the limiting resources in our iron to steel refining. The more lime you have, the more steel you can create. In our example, we're continuously taming 2 Pokeshells. These are our breeder Pokeshells, and these unfortunately are just being starved to death to produce their molts. Once they go into adulthood, they'll produce that small Pokeshell molt, and then once they die, they'll produce the adult molt. A key feature here, we keep this door locked. We don't want duplicants to come in here. You can see in our other example that's been around for a little longer, there's a lot of angry Pokeshells in here. But whenever they have a molt, the duplicant will come right here and be able to pick up the molt and bring it to the Rock Crusher. No danger at all to our duplicant. Now, there are definitely other ways to do this. For instance, anytime that you find a pinchrow egg in the wild, you could dump it into a pool. These Pokeshells can't go hungry because they're wild, and before the end of their life, they'll produce one more pinchrow egg. Now, this will definitely be a sustainable source of line. It just won't produce as many Pokeshells as our breeder and taming example. One recommendation is if you do put them in a tank, put a ladder and just make sure the duplicants can reach the bottom of the tank, but they don't have to go down here at the bottom. You can set up an automatic dispenser with a sweep only and pinchrow, so anytime you find a pinchrow egg, they'll come drop it off in here, and eventually you'll have a pool of Pokeshells. But remember, this ladder is very important. We have a duplicant coming to drop off an egg right now. Old Turner just dropped an egg off in the automatic dispenser. It drops down into our pool. And instantly, these Pokeshells get very mad at everything they can find, to include the Paku. But with the ladder here, the Pokeshells can't get the dupes, and the dupes can still pick up all the eggshells and all the molts they can find. And because these Pokeshells will keep killing this Paku, you have to make some other contingencies. For instance, you could wall these Paku off and then have a simple auto sweeper and conveyor loader system dropping off all the polluted dirt that they produce. But at that point, you'd only be using the Pokeshells to eat the polluted dirt and get rid of it. Because remember, wild critters do not need to eat. One other little stable trick that I like to use, especially in the later game when you have plenty of power and you don't mind throwing some extra automation around, I like to use the critter sensor. Now, the critter sensor in here is set to below 2. So at any time there's below 2 critters in here, it'll activate this incubator. Now, a disable incubator does not prevent duplicants from putting an egg into it, but it does prevent it from being powered. What we'll do is we'll take one of our wonderful Pokeshells and we will attack it with furious vengeance. And now that that Pokeshell has died, the critter sensor knows that, hey, there's only one critter in here. We need to enable this incubator, which this powers it. The reason why you would do this, that way you have as little downtime as possible. So there's always 2 Pokeshells in here breeding. The more Pokeshells you have in your little area here, the more molts they're going to produce. And when you combine the small Pokeshell molts, the large Pokeshell molts, and the eggshells, you'll have a decent sustainable source of lime. After all, 100 kilos of steel only requires 10 kilos of lime. I hope I've shown you a few different ways that you can run Pokeshells in your colony. But before we go, I want to show each setting on each specific building inside the stable. There are plenty of new players among us, and so just to make sure to answer any of those small questions they might have. Remember, your storage bin will need to have polluted dirt and rot piles selected. I like to keep my storage bins on a setting of 4, so that it's not the first thing that the duplicants will go and do. Then, we have a critter feeder set on a priority lower than the storage bin. That way the duplicant won't come and load the critter feeder. They'd rather load the storage bin. And then our auto sweeper will take care of loading this critter feeder. Always have your critter drop off set on both adults and children. because invariably you're going to end up wrangling an adult and they need to be able to get into the stable as well. In this example, we have the Max Critters to 2. We have our conveyor loader set on pinch row. Additionally, if you really want to get fancy, you could also have the conveyor loader picking up all the Pokeshell molts, and then you could split off the Pokeshell molts from the pinch row eggs using a solid filter. And in that case, then you could have all the molts sent and dropped off here right by the rock crusher, so your duplicates don't have to run as far. Finally, you need to make sure that the auto sweeper cannot see inside this door, because you don't want them re-picking up the eggs and putting them inside the conveyor loader. And yes, even on sandboxes, we like to keep our duplicates happy. Look at this. Even in a sandbox map, our dupes are living the life. I hope you enjoyed this short example of different things you can do with those Pokeshells. And as the name of the colony says, thank you for watching. Talk to you soon.